Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen of YouTube. Today we are going to explore the life of William the Conqueror and the Norman Conquest of England. So, to begin our lesson, to begin learning about the life of William, I think we need to learn more about the Normans, his people. So, if you go back a few generations before William to, I believe, his great-great-great-great-grandfather, we find a gentleman by the name of Rollo. And Rollo is often referred to as Ralph. But the important thing that you need to know about him is that he is a Viking. He's from Scandinavia. He's a warlord, essentially. And he had upset certain people back at home, so his faction has to leave Scandinavia. And being raiders, they're very fit to do that. So they hit the beach in northern France, in Normandy, and they begin to sack the place, they begin to pillage and raid and tear the place apart. And the French king at the time, Charles the Simple, who was clearly a very simple man when it came to dealing with Vikings, at least insofar as he was unable to stop Rollo, decided to make a deal with him. In exchange for Rollo ceasing to pillage the French countryside, Charles the Simple would give Rollo the Duchy of Normandy as a hereditary duchy. So Rollo would become the Duke of Normandy, and it would be a hereditary position that his son and grandson and descendants going down through history would essentially inherit. So he gets a hereditary duchy in Normandy, and he also gets Charles the Simple's daughter as a wife. So now his children are also part of the French royal bloodline, and that brings them into the feudal network in France. But in exchange, Rollo has to swear an oath of fealty or loyalty to Charles the Simple, the King of France, and he has to convert to Roman Catholicism from the pagan religion that he had practiced beforehand. And he also has to accommodate the king's will. He has to fight for the king, and he has to support him. And the family that was in charge of Normandy for generations did support the king, and they were very loyal dukes within the French system. But a few generations later, you end up with an individual who's a descendant of Rollo, and his name is Robert. And we very often refer to Robert as Robert the Devil or Robert the Dreadful, because Robert wasn't really the best guy who's ever lived from most people's perspective. He killed his brother so that he could be duke, because he wasn't actually the next in line to rule the Norman Duchy. So he kills his brother to become duke. But before he had ever done that, he was the Count of Falaise. Falaise is just a little town in Normandy, and he was the Count of it. And he's a 17-year-old boy. And I think common sense would tell most of us that a 17-year-old should never be given totalitarian control over any quantity of people, even if it's just a small village like Falaise. And being a 17-year-old boy and being immature and disrespectful, he found a young lady that he liked very much. He found her to be very, very attractive, and her name is Arla, usually spelled Harlotte. Sometimes they refer to her as Harleve or Harleva, but it's usually a soft H either way, so Harleve or Arla. And he really was attracted to her, and he wanted to sleep with her. So, being a totalitarian ruler of this village, which is what he essentially was as the Count of Falaise, and not having any real skill with women, he decided to arrest her father. Her father's name is Fulbert, and he was a tanner, so he's essentially just a peasant. And Robert arrests Fulbert, and he stretches him out on the rack, which is a medieval torture device. And he stretches Fulbert on the rack until he is willing to send his daughter to Robert's bedside. At least that was the plan. Supposedly, Fulbert never broke, and he never ordered his daughter to go to Robert's bedside. He just endured the torture day in and day out. But eventually, he supposedly said something to the effect that, well, he will never order his daughter to the bedside of Robert. He wouldn't object if she went willingly, if it was her decision. So, after this declaration was made under much torture, Robert brings the message to Arlette, who really wants her father to get out of the dungeon for kind of obvious reasons. And when Arlette hears this message, she decides that she would be willing to go to Robert's bedside in exchange for the release of her father. But she had one condition, and that condition was that Robert would send a group of mounted feudal knights to escort her to and from the castle, because she didn't want to be seen as a sort of courtesan coming and going from the bedside of a noble, just, you know, like some peasant girl. So Robert agrees. He sends mounted knights, they pick her up, they bring her to his bedside, Fulbert is released, and they have a child. And that child is William. And William is the whole reason we're having this conversation today. He was born in 1028. We think of him as William the Conqueror, but when he was born, he was William the Bastard. That was his title, William the Bastard, the son of Aethelings and Robert the Devil. And later on, as we know, he would become the conqueror. He'd conquer the Anglo-Saxons of southern Britain, and they didn't really like him, as you can understand, being a foreign conqueror. And being the quasi-immature people that humans tend to be, for generations and generations, they referred to William the Conqueror's mother as a whore. The whore that gave out to Robert the Devil and created this bastard monstrosity that conquered southern England. So after so many generations of referring to William's mother as a whore, the word harlot develops in the English language, which is sort of an insult. It basically amounts to calling someone a whore, to refer to them as a harlot. And that's the origins of the word harlot in the English language. But either way, William is now born, the bastard child of Robert. And by the early 1030s, Robert realizes that he is rather ill. He's now the Duke of Normandy, having killed his brother, but he's ill and he's dying. And even though he's a real bad guy, he is a believing Catholic, like most people in the Middle Ages. And he believes that he is a very sinful man and that he is dying and that he will be literally burning in the fires of hell in a few weeks, or maybe months if he's lucky. So, in a panic, he runs off to the Holy Land on pilgrimage and dies in 1035. And when he dies in 1035, William the Bastard is his son and heir. Before he left, he had actually called all of his vassals forward and forced them to swear an oath of fealty, of loyalty to his son William. Every time I give this presentation, I always ask the attending audience, let's see a show of hands, how many of you like to be bossed around by a 7-year-old bastard? Does anyone here like to be bossed around by a 7-year-old bastard? No, I've never had anyone raise their hand and tell me, I like to be bossed around by a 7-year-old bastard. No one has ever said that, and it's actually been kind of a surprise to me. The very first time that I asked a crowd that question, I was expecting everyone to be very caustic and sarcastic and to say, oh yeah, sure, I love being bossed around by a 7-year-old bastard, but no one's actually said that yet. So I take it that no one likes being bossed around by a 7-year-old bastard, and of course the people of Normandy were no different back then. So after Robert dies in 1035, And William the Bastard is left as the technical Duke of Normandy. No one listens to him because he's just a 7-year-old bastard. And this begins what we call the minority of the Norman Duchy. Minority. And the minority of the Norman Duchy is this period that lasts from Robert's death in 1035 until 1060, when William is technically Duke, but he has limited control over his own duchy. Everyone knows the platitude, when the cat is away, the mice will play. And that definitely was what was going on during the minority of the Norman Duchy. No one's listening to this 7-year-old bastard. Well, eventually this 7-year-old bastard starts to grow up. And an event occurred in 1047. And this event is the Battle of Valles Dunes. And this is a really interesting battle. It's like something that you'd find from a book about King Arthur or Ivanhoe or one of those sort of Arthurian figures. Because it's a battle that involves lots and lots of people. It occurs in Normandy, lots of William's vassals. King Henri I of France, the king of all of these French duchies and counties, is there. You have all sorts of nobles from all over the place in France that are all in one place for this battle. And the thing is, they don't have any enlisted military personnel. They don't have any of your normal serfs standing there with their pikes in formation ready to fight each other. The battle occurs more like a medieval joust between noble knights, only they were actually, fighting to kill, which they usually didn't do when they jousted. But it was really formal, and it probably didn't seem very much like a battle to most people that were there, because they'd kind of take turns, and if a knight was knocked off his horse, everyone would stop fighting so he could get up and remount and have a drink of water, and they wait till he's ready to continue fighting. So there isn't really as much fighting as you would think at the Battle of Valles Dunes, but I'm told that William the Bastard did a very good job. He was a very impressive figure at Valles Dunes. I think, it's my opinion, that the Battle of Valles Dunes serves more as a diplomatic conference between the various nobles of France than it serves as a military endeavor. Because you see a sort of effect where all of the leading people are together and they're talking to each other and they're conspiring and they're working out deals. It reminds me of the modern United Nations. It reminds me of perhaps some unmoderated caucusing event within the General Assembly of the current UN, where you have all the delegates discussing matters of geopolitics with each other and forming deals and new alliances and betraying each other and those kinds of things. And that is what happened at the Battle of Valles Dunes. And you can see it reflected in the fighting, because the people that were initially fighting each other when the battle began, a lot of them switched sides. So William went into it without a lot of friends. He actually did very well for himself and came out of it with a lot of friends, including King Henri I of France, although throughout the years of the minority of the Norman Duchy, that would be back and forth. Sometimes he'd be King Henri's friend, and at other times he'd be King Henri's mortal enemy. But this is significant because after the Battle of Valles Dunes in 1047, we now have a William who is very powerful. He's beginning to emerge as a very talented military tactician and later a very talented military strategist. He's definitely a very bright individual. And this rivalry begins to develop between William and an individual by the name of Geoffrey II. And Geoffrey II is the Count of Anjou. Anjou is the county that's directly south of Normandy, and this is the arch enemy of William. He's the son of an individual by the name of Fulk the Black, and his nickname is Martel. You guys probably remember Charles Martel. You know, Martel means hammer, so it implies that he's a very talented military leader, which he was. He was a very talented adversary for young William to par with, and they fought very often from 1047 onward until the end of the period of the minority of the Norman Duchy. So all of this fighting occurs. William is constantly at war with his own vassals and with neighboring nobles throughout these years from 1035 to 1060, and his archenemy is Geoffrey II. There was one particular event that I think is really worth pointing out. I certainly don't have time to go into all of the battles that took place, or all of the changes in who was fighting who, and all the major players of this minority period. But if you're interested, there's lots of good works by individuals such as George Slocum, for example, on these wars of the minority of the Norman Duchy. And David C. Douglas, he's another really good historian if you want to research this topic in more depth. But there are two battles that I would like to talk about that occurred, because I think they really help you to understand William. So there's two towns that are kind of border fortresses between Anjou and Normandy. And they're Domfront and Alencon. Sorry about my French pronunciations, probably pronounced wrong. Alencon, there's no thing like that going on. So, battles of Domfront and Alencon. And in the year, I believe it was 1051, William has besieged Domfront, and he has clear military superiority. But Domfront has a really nice wall, really nice fortifications, and it's going to take William a while to build the proper siege weapons that he needs to knock down the ramparts of Domfront and get in there and capture the place. So this long besiegement has begun, and Domfront is anxiously waiting for the reinforcements from Geoffrey Martel of Anjou. So William wants to speed up this conquest because, well, he's tied up in Domfront, he can't really make any other moves. And during the Middle Ages, there was a certain tradition that if the town surrendered to you, you would spare the population. But if the town resisted, you'd massacre every man, woman, child, and goat that you found in the place. And that made this a huge gamble for Domfront, because they know if those walls go down, they're going to lose. And they know, having resisted, that everyone's going to be massacred if they lose. So it's a big gamble. William was a really good chess player. He always knew what his enemy was thinking, and he always was able to use that to his advantage. He was able to recognize when his enemy was nervous, and he was able to exploit that anxiety and blow it out of proportion to make his enemy make bad decisions. So he left Domfront, and he attacked the nearby town of Alencon. And Alencon doesn't have the nice fortifications Domfront has, so he's able to take it more easily. And he shows exceptional brutality to the population of Alencon, so that the population of Domfront becomes even more afraid, because they're already on the breaking point of anxiety here in 1051. And he knows that if he can just push them over, they will surrender to him. So that's exactly what he does. Also, you should note that at Alencon, supposedly when his troops approached, all of the archers of Alencon hung the foreskins of cattle over the sides of their walls. And then they yelled all kinds of derogatory remarks about William's mother and her father, Fulbert the tanner. Because, you know, a tanner works with the hides of cattle to make leather. And they made some really inappropriate gestures, basically, towards William's mother. So they further irritated him when he was already going there to basically make an example of these people for Domfront, which didn't help sway William's heart towards mercy. So he was exceptionally brutal with the population at Alencon. And Domfront finds out about this. They hear the news, and it worked. They send a delegate to meet with William, and he pleads with William for mercy. He requests that they be allowed to surrender and not be massacred, and William consents. Domfront opens the gates, and William essentially captured 2 cities for the price of 1 in 1051. So here I think he's deploying really good strategy opposed to good tactics. He is someone who thinks inside and outside the box. He's someone who can think about psychology as well as sorry, I meant to say he's someone who can think about the psychological elements of warfare as well as the more physical, tangible elements of war. So he's a very bright and talented man, and by the end of the 1050s, he's clearly the most powerful faction in France. So you have basically all of France united against William, and he's still holding up a good fight. And then, in 1060, a miracle occurred for William. Geoffrey II, Geoffrey Martel of Anjou, dies. And King Henri, King of France, dies. Both in 1060. And there was a dispute within the Angevin dynasty in terms of who would succeed Geoffrey II as the next Count of Anjou. So Anjou collapses into a state of civil war and is now no longer a threat for William. And King Henri's Dauphin, his prince, his heir to the throne, who's now king, is a child. He's essentially the 7-year-old that William was when William took over. So you have the whole, when the cat is away, the mice will play effect that is going to occur in France once more, only this time it's the King of England who is inconvenienced by this phenomenon. So, William has nothing to worry about. The minority is over. All of his enemies are dead. He is powerful. He asserts all of the authority that a Duke of Normandy might want to assert. He can do whatever he wants. And he's a pretty smart guy. He is seen as a really strong economic leader. He developed the feudal economy very well in Normandy and elsewhere within his control, and he wanted to expand his influence into Flanders, which is the county that was due east of Normandy. And Flanders was run by a count named Baldwin, who I believe had helped raise him and had been an old ally of his when he was a young man during the years of the minority. And he's also technically the individual who is in charge of the 7-year-old King of France. The 7-year-old King of France has been placed as his ward. So he's a really important guy, and of course the Flemish lowlands are probably the most lucrative part of Europe during the Middle Ages because of the textile mills that they're going to be developing around these times on the Rhine. So Flanders is a very, very important place for William to expand his influence. So he goes to Baldwin's daughter, Matilda, who the legends tell us was very beautiful. And she supposedly had very long blonde hair. And William found her just completely ravishing. And being that sort of romantic, noble knight that William could be at times, he approached Matilda and got down on one knee and proposed to her and said all sorts of sweet things in French and Latin to the young lady. And she responded by laughing in his face and saying that she would never marry a bastard, because of course William still is technically a bastard. And at that moment, the gentleman in William sort of disintegrated, and he went into that barbarian mode that he had demonstrated so fully at Domfront and Alençon in 1051. And he stood up, grabbed Matilda by her hair, pulled her down to her knees, and kicked her upside the head, which was pretty insulting to the people of Flanders, especially to Baldwin. And Baldwin really liked William, at least until he pulled his daughter's hair and kicked her in the face. And Baldwin really wanted good relations with William as much as William wanted good relations with Baldwin. But now, Baldwin is compelled by honor to fight William. And this puts them in sort of a predicament that is not ideal for either party, because now they're sort of obligated by honor's sake to destroy each other in a war no one wants to have. So Matilda feels bad having created this situation by calling William a bastard and denying his proposal. So she makes a public declaration that she will marry only one man in the world, and that man is William. So Matilda marries William. And initially the Catholic Church doesn't approve of this marriage for various political reasons. And that would be kind of an interesting situation, because William had a monk whose name was Lanfranc, and he worked for William, and he would continually serve as a diplomat between the papacy and William. There'd be a lot of negotiations on that front to make this marriage church official after the ceremony and so forth was already concluded. And eventually Norman knights in Sicily, because you have to remember that the Sicilian dynasty, all those King Rogers of Sicily that we see throughout the Middle Ages, were also of Norman stock. They were also the descendants of Rollo. Normans down in Sicily were also on bad terms with the same pope, and they'd end up conquering him at one point and forcing him to recognize the marriage between Matilda and William. So with that in mind, a lot of people think that William was not a good Catholic. He wasn't on very good terms with the Catholic Church. Of course, he's a bastard. His father was probably not a very good Catholic in certain ways, but that is not at all the case. William is actually a very good Catholic. He supposedly never took any mistresses throughout his entire life, which was actually sort of an anomaly in medieval rulers. And he invested a lot of money into the monasteries of Normandy. And he went a step further than that. He assisted in a wave of monastic reform referred to as Cluniac reform. Cluniac reform. So, throughout the Middle Ages, the monks have all kinds of obligations. They have obligations to be pious individuals, to adhere to vows of celibacy and chastity and poverty. They have obligations to pray at certain designated times of the day. They have obligations to live holy lives. They also have more scholarly obligations at times. It's the job of monks to be the literate persons of the Middle Ages who are going to store important texts and transcribe the texts so that way books can be preserved and copied in the Middle Ages. So they have some very important roles because they're supposed to be the intellectual and the spiritual leaders of the Middle Ages. But the monasteries had really gone to hell, okay? Really had gone to hell by the 11th century. Most monks were the younger siblings of noble families, and because you could only give one of your kids the land, the oldest son got the land and got to be a knight, and all of his younger brothers became monks. So it's not like they were really particularly scholarly or pious individuals that were becoming monks. They were just kind of the noble kids that had nothing to do because they didn't get the land. So these monks were people that were very lecherous. They had lots of women. They weren't supposed to be doing that with a vow of celibacy, much less as the good Catholics they were supposed to be, but they were probably the most lustful and lecherous people in all of the Middle Ages. So that's obviously bad. They were known to be alcoholics. They were young men, and being young men during the Middle Ages, they were known to brawl a lot. They trashed the monastery because, young men are filthy. And they weren't very pious. They weren't getting a lot done either on the religious front or on the scholastic front. They were just straight out of line, and they needed to be cleaned up. And this is something that the papacy and William and a bunch of abbots, the people that were running these monasteries, all agreed on. So they implemented a Cluniac reform, which is basically a movement of cleaning these monasteries up, and with the support of William, they were able to do it. Some of you may have heard of a work called the Proslogium that maybe you had to read at one point if you took a philosophy course, but it was written by an individual named Saint Anselm. And Saint Anselm was a monk at this time in one of these Cluniac monasteries in Normandy that was cleaned up by William the Conqueror, which allowed him to write the Proslogium, where he makes his famous ontological argument for the existence of God, which is seen as a really high level of thinking for this period in the Middle Ages. The sort of logic and epistemology he was able to tie into his philosophy was really remarkable. So you see a guy who is more than just a brute. He's more than just a military leader. He's making good economic and diplomatic decisions by bringing Flanders, the lucrative Flemish lowlands, into his sphere of influence via marrying Matilda, which also keeps the French king under his control because the French king is a ward of Baldwin's. And he's also on very good terms now with the Catholic Church because he implemented all of this clinic reform, and he would also stretch his hand into nearby Brittany, which is due west of Normandy. He'd send his military across the border and he'd stir stuff up over there, which ironically got them to ally with the Angevins, who were still fighting their civil war, and that caused Brittany to get caught up in the Angevin civil war, which further destabilized them, which served William's interests. So he's clearly a very bright individual. He made very good decisions, and this allowed Normandy to really flourish and become more and more powerful in the years immediately following the minority of the Norman Duchy. So William is the conqueror of Britain. That's what we all know him as. So let's talk a little bit about what's going on in Britain during these years of the minority and the years immediately following the minority of the Norman Duchy. If you go to Britain around the time that William was born, an individual by the name of Ethelred the Unready was king of Britain, king of England. And people look at this unready and they don't know what it means. They assume that means he wasn't ready for class today. He didn't do his homework. He was unready in the most obvious sense. But that's not completely what it meant. Unready really meant he was ill-counseled. He had bad advisors. He was given bad advice. In fact, he was given such bad advice that a Dane, a Viking named Canute, just showed up one day, cut his head off, and married his wife named Emma, and took his kingdom from him. And he had no idea this was coming because he was so incredibly poorly advised. All right? So Canute shows up, takes everything he has and cuts off his head. So now Ethelred's out of the picture. And he marries his wife, Emma. By the way, Emma was the sister of Robert of Normandy, the father of William, which makes Emma the aunt of William. So there's a direct bloodline now between Ethelred and his children with Emma. Sorry about that. Gravity applies even in history, not just physics. There is a direct bloodline between Ethelred and Emma's children, who we call the Aethelings. The Aethelings. The first of the Aethelings is Arthur. The second of the Aethelings is Edward. This is the Edward that is usually referred to as Edward the Confessor. When their father's head gets cut off and their mother is married to the individual who cut off his head, the Aethelings are banished. And usually when you're fleeing for your life, you go to hide with people that you trust, not people that you don't trust. And usually if you trust anyone in the world, it's your relatives, it's your family. When times get tough, families usually stick together. So they go across the channel and they live initially with their uncle Robert, and then Robert dies, and then they live with their cousin William throughout all the years of the minority of the Norman Duchy. So during those desperate years where William was struggling to survive, his cousins were struggling to survive with him. And things looked really, really ominous for Arthur, Edward, and William when they were growing up. But somehow, they made it through. Emma also had a child with Canute, though. after she married Canute. And this individual is named Hardicanute. And Hardicanute has a brother that's the child of Canute and a Danish woman that had been married to Canute earlier. This individual's name is Harold Harefoot. So you have all of these individuals in kind of a power struggle, as you can see. Ethelred is dead. Then Canute dies, because everyone dies, and Canute eventually gets old and dies, as individuals do. And his son Hardicanute is supposed to succeed him. But Canute was king of Denmark. So Hardicanute succeeds him in Denmark and in Britain. Just like myself, Hardicanute cannot defy the laws of physics. He cannot be in two places at one time. So, he has to choose. Am I going to live in Denmark or am I going to live in Britain? And he decides to stay in Denmark initially, because the Norwegians, led by this king by the name of Magnus, had invaded Denmark, and he wants to defend his Danish homeland. Meanwhile, Harold Harefoot, his brother, makes a claim on the throne of Britain. So he's going to fight Magnus of Norway, in Norway, and he's going to leave a vassal in charge in Britain to fight his brother, Harold Harefoot. And this vassal, a little more board space here, this vassal's name is Godwin. Godwin is the most powerful man in England after the king. He is the Earl of Wessex, the most powerful of the English earldoms. So it's Godwin's job to fight Harold Harefoot while Hardicanute fights Magnus of Norway. Things aren't going very well, though, for Godwin, in the absence of Hardicanute and his potential support for his war effort. So, Godwin eventually switches sides. He makes a deal with Harold Harefoot because he believes that Harold Harefoot's going to win and Hardicanute's never coming back. And after Godwin joins forces with Harold Harefoot, they capture one of these Aetheling boys, Arthur. And Godwin hands Arthur over to Harold Harefoot, whose men take him out in a boat and rip out his eyeballs. They literally ripped his eyeballs out of his head and stuck a big knife into his guts, ripped his intestines out, and he died. A horrible death. Arthur is no more. End of story for him. But then, Magnus makes a deal with Hardicanute, because Hardicanute is desperate. He wants to get back. He wants to come back home so he can finish this war. So he makes a deal. And the way that this deal works, if Hardicanute dies without an heir, then Magnus will become the king of Britain, or his son will. By the way, his son is Harold Hardradi, who is serving as a Varangian. I'm sorry about that. We just experienced some technical difficulties. The memory card on my camera went out, so it cut me off mid-sentence. So what I was about to say before that inconveniently occurred is that Magnus had a son by the name of Harold Hardradi. And Magnus had just reached an agreement with Hardicanute that he would end the war between Norway and Denmark if Hardicanute would agree to give his son, Harold Hardradi, his land in Britain in the event of his death without an heir. Okay? So if Hardicanute dies without an heir, and he had no heir up until this point, then Harold Hardradi would become Hardicanute's heir and would inherit Britain. So this ends the war in Denmark. and it allows Hardicanute to return home to fight his brother Harold Harefoot. And in the meantime, his vassal Godwin had betrayed him, as was mentioned earlier, and had switched sides and had begun to work for Harold Harefoot. So now Godwin is becoming very concerned because he knows Hardicanute is on his way home. And then, to make things worse, Harold Harefoot dies of alcohol poisoning, supposedly. And now Godwin is left alone, and his boss is coming back, and he's going to be very angry because Godwin betrayed him. So Godwin does what anyone would do in this situation, and he buys Hardicanute a boat, a really nice, expensive ship. And the idea is, I give you this really, really nice boat. After all, who doesn't want a nice boat? Why don't you look the other way about me betraying you and everything? And Hardicanute is pleased with the ship, and he accepts everything, takes Godwin back in. In some ways, he didn't really have much of a choice. Godwin, as the Earl of Wessex, the most important of the Anglo-Saxon earldoms, was the most powerful man in England, so if he was going to try to remove Godwin, it probably would have led to another war, which Hardicanute certainly did not want. So now Godwin is back in a good place, and the war is over. But then Hardicanute dies. And when Hardicanute dies, this changes everything. Because now the individual who is the heir to the throne is Edward the Confessor, the other Aetheling boy. So this other Aetheling is now king. And Godwin, who's the second most powerful man in England, had handed his brother Arthur over to be mercilessly tortured to death, to have his eyes ripped out of his head and his intestines ripped out of his guts. Godwin is responsible for that, and now he has to serve his brother, Edward. And that creates a huge amount of animosity between the Godwinians and the surviving Aetheling king, Edward the Confessor. So Godwin does what he always does when he's on bad terms with his boss, and he buys his boss a nice boat. Just think about that for a second. Would you forgive someone for torturing your brother to death, ripping his eyes out of his head, his intestines out of his guts, if he bought you a nice boat? Well, Edward did. Kind of. But not really. Technically he did. He technically accepted this apology and took Godwin in, but like Hardicanute, Edward recognizes that this is the most powerful earl in England, and to oppose him directly will lead to a massive war. And no one wants that as a ruler. No one wants a civil war in their kingdom. So he accepts the boat, and in order to show his sincerity towards this offer of a vessel, Edward the Confessor also marries Godwin's daughter, Edith. But really, he doesn't like Godwin, and he doesn't like the Godwinians, all of Godwin's children and relatives and political allies. So even though Edward the Confessor and Edith are married, their marriage wasn't a very good marriage in a certain sense. This is where we get to focus on the term, the Confessor. Edward knew that if he and Edith ever had a child, that child would be the Godwinian heir to the throne of England. He knew that their union would lead the Godwinians to take complete control of England. And he hates the Godwinians with everything in him. He hates the Godwinians. He really does. So, he refused to have any sexual relations with his wife ever. And during the Middle Ages, celibacy was regarded as something that was very holy. And another word for holy was confessor. So, even though he's the confessor, he didn't necessarily confess anything per se, but rather he was celibate. He is Edward the Confessor because he never had sex with his wife, ever, under any circumstances. But this really, really upset his father-in-law, because when his father-in-law gave him his daughter as a wife, his father-in-law wanted a grandchild that would become the King of England. And since this isn't happening, it leads to further hostilities. Edith has a bunch of brothers, the oldest of which is named Sweyn, then Harold, and another named Tostig. And all of these individuals, they don't exactly have last names yet, but if you wanted to give them a last name, it would be Godwinson, because they're the sons of Godwin. These are the Godwinson boys. And the Godwinson boys are going to continually fight with the Aetheling king. There's going to be a power struggle between the Aetheling king, Edward, and the Godwinians. And Edward is going to continue to bring more and more Normans into his court and have Normans running his kingdom. And that was his way of ousting all of the Anglo-Saxons that were loyal to Godwin and pushing them back. But every time he did this, he would further irritate the Godwinian clan, and that would lead to further tensions and hostilities. Eventually, Edward whipped up the courage to declare William, his cousin, his heir. Okay, so now we're back to William of Normandy, his cousin who took care of him. He doesn't want the Godwinians to take over. He wants a powerful and smart person who knows how to hold power, and he's seen William do that in these wars of the minority of the Norman Duchy. And he also wants someone he likes, and he likes his cousin William because his cousin William took care of him his entire life. So he names his cousin William as his heir. And this really upset the Godwinian clan and led to a lot of fighting and some minor military campaigns and things of that sort between the Godwinians and Edward, kind of off and on for a while. And in the process of these hostilities, the oldest of the Godwinian boys, Sweyn, is killed, and Harold ends up on the wrong side of the English Channel. He ends up in Normandy, and he ends up a prisoner of William of Normandy's. And supposedly William was actually very good to him while he was his prisoner. He wasn't exactly stretched out on the rack like poor Fulbert was not that long ago. He was treated very well. And at the time, William was waging war in Brittany, the jurisdiction that was due west of Normandy, and he brought Harold along so that way Harold could see what an amazing military commander he was, that he'd fear him and respect him and so forth. And he brought him along, and they observed these conflicts between Brittany and Normandy. And then one night, after dinner with lots of people as witnesses, William forces Harold to swear an oath of fealty to him. This oath of fealty is essentially an oath of loyalty. Basically, he's swearing to acknowledge William. Harold is swearing to acknowledge William as the legitimate heir of Edward the Confessor, the legitimate heir to the throne of England. And there are some claims that Harold may have been to some degree deceived or tremendously coerced, and there's some arguments in terms of how deceived or how coerced he may or may not have been, but the facts that most historians seem to be able to agree upon are that they were having dinner. It was kind of that formal medieval dining room that we've probably seen in films before. And after the meal, some objects covered by cloth were brought forward, and Harold was instructed to place his hand on the cloth and to swear the oath of fealty to William. And then after the oath was sworn, they pulled the cloth back, and Harold was shocked at all of these relics, these really holy relics that he had just sworn this oath on. And it apparently really upset Harold because the degree in which a person was obligated to their oath depended, I guess, on the value of the relics, and these were very valuable relics. So now he's obliged to adhere to this oath of fealty, and he is sent back to England. But then, not much later, in January of 1066, Edward the Confessor dies. He has no kids. So, who is the next king of England, is the big question, with Edward dead. Well, based on the oath, it would be William, but Harold doesn't accept that. So, Harold declares himself to be king, and Harold is acknowledged by the Anglo-Saxon Witan, which was sort of like an assembly of nobles within the Anglo-Saxon system, and they recognized Harold as their king. So now Harold Godwinson is king, and as soon as William finds out about this, he feels betrayed, and he begins preparing for war. This is in January of 1066. But he's not the only person with a claim to the throne. You remember Magnus, the king of Norway? He was at war with Hardicanute, and the war with Hardicanute ended when Hardicanute promised his son, Harold Hardrade, Britain in the event of his death. Well, Hardicanute died without heirs. So, based on that treaty, Hardicanute had essentially given Britain to Harold Hardrade. So Harold Hardrade now has a claim on the throne. His father Magnus is long dead, and he's a very talented military leader as well. I think I mentioned earlier he was a Varangian mercenary in the Byzantine military before. So he's definitely a figure not to be underestimated. So in September, Harold Hardrade's troops show up. So we see this battle of Fulford, and this occurs on the 22nd of September in 1066. Okay, this is the Battle of Fulford, and in this battle, Harold Hardrade fights Harold Godwinson for control of England. And Harold Hardrade has some help from Tostig, who is the brother of Harold Godwinson, because Tostig had been the Earl of Northumbria. And the people of Northumbria had risen up in revolt against him and chased him off. And for political reasons, his brother Harold supported those who ousted him and the new regime in Northumbria. So Tostig feels betrayed by his brother, so he joins Harold Hardrade at Fulford. Nevertheless, Harold Hardrade and Tostig are defeated by Harold Godwinson. This is a defeat for Hardrade. And then, 3 days later, at Stamford Bridge, Hardrade and Tostig fight the sequel to the battle. So this is on the 25th of September in 1066. And at the subsequent battle, which is really like Fulford Round 2, Tostig is killed and Harold Hardrade is killed. So now this claim to the throne by Harold Hardrade is gone, because there is no more Harold Hardrade, and Tostig is no longer a threat to Harold Godwinson. William of Normandy is a very lucky man, though, because he set sail for England to conquer it on the 27th of September, 2 days after the Battle of Stamford Bridge. 2 days. And there's no way that he could have known about the battles of Fulford and Stamford Bridge. It took too long for a message to cross the channel and get to his attention for him to have possibly known that this is going on. But he really lucked out. He crossed the channel at the perfect time. And when William crossed, William showed up in a town called Hastings in southern England. And when he gets to Hastings, he figures out what happened, because people tell him, he finds out what the local news is. in England, and he finds out about Fulford and Stamford Bridge. And if you go back to the Wars of the Minority, you probably remember that at Domfront and Alencon, he found a desperate enemy, and he put the pressure to them psychologically to make them essentially make a bad move so that he could conquer them. He's going to do the same thing at Hastings. He knows that Harold Godwinson just fought 2 really big battles. He knows that his men are tired, injured, and dead. So he wants this battle to occur as quickly as possible. So William begins to harass the people of Hastings. He probably killed some civilians. He probably burned some crops and villages. He was a real rough guy because he knows that the enemy king, knowing that his people are being killed and his land is being destroyed, is going to act rashly. And that's exactly what Harold Godwinson does. He rushes in to fight William the Conqueror. So, on October 16th of 1066, the Battle of Hastings takes place. And at the Battle of Hastings, Harold approaches, but he does not have all of the professional huscarls that he had at Fulford and Stamford Bridge, because so many were dead, injured, or tired. So he replaced a lot of them with guys that never fought before, local garrisons. And they don't know what they're doing. These are not professional soldiers. So when Hastings begins, William sent a preliminary force forward, basically like scouts, just to kind of shake up the enemy lines. And they're massacred, as William probably expected. And after that first line of scouts is massacred, Harold Godwinson's inexperienced troops don't know what to make of it. And they thought they just won the entire battle, when in reality the battle hadn't even started yet. So they break rank and just start massacring Norman scouts, which wasn't very smart. And Harold and the few professional huscarls that he brought with him begin to panic as well, and they're yelling orders into just a mob. I mean, it's just a chaotic mob, and they're trying to retake control of the situation. The situation's completely gone to hell, and they're trying to clean it up. And they're having a really, really hard time doing this. William notices the chaos that's going on the other side of the battlefield, so he orders his archers to start shooting across the battlefield at the Anglo-Saxons. So as the Anglo-Saxons are experiencing just bitter chaos and are trying to reorganize and form ranks and take control of the situation, now they have arrows pouring down on them, and the confusion gets worse and worse and worse, and the situation just keeps deteriorating for poor Harold. And then Harold catches an arrow to the eye. It rips through his helmet into his eyeball, and supposedly he kept yelling orders. He just kind of tried to tough it up and ignore it, and he's riding around on the battlefield with an arrow hanging out of his eye, yelling orders, trying to rally the men. And as he's doing this, arrows are still falling, chaos is still ensuing, and feudal knights push through that line and chop Harold up into a bunch of pieces. They cut his arms and his legs off, they cut his head off, supposedly they cut his member off, they just cut him apart. So this is the end of Harold. Harold is now dead as well, and of course Godwin himself had died much earlier because he was obviously a lot older than his children. So, now we have a situation where the Godwinians are gone. And the Danes of Canute and the Norwegians of Magnus and Harald Hardrade are gone. They're all gone. Everyone is gone except for William. He's the only surviving person with a claim on the throne of England. He won. So now William is no longer William the Bastard. He is William the Conqueror. Good for him. So William the Conqueror is crowned King William I of England on Christmas Day in 1066, and then he went back to France to basically celebrate, I guess you'd say. And this is clearly a good thing for him. The Anglo-Saxons, as you can imagine, weren't tremendously happy, and they rose up in revolt several times, but they were never able to put together an organized effort. They were very disorganized. There were lots of factional disputes between different groups of Anglo-Saxons, and they usually ended up fighting each other whenever they built big armies instead of the Normans, which doesn't help if you're trying to get rid of the Normans. Also, William was very smart, and the Normans were very impressive builders of castles, which were essentially just military fortifications. And they built a network of castles throughout southern England, and that helped them to control the population. So they do a very good job holding England as well. There are some really important changes, though, that we see in England after the Norman Conquest. For one thing, now you have a French-speaking aristocracy that's going to remain in Britain for centuries. The other big change, and I think the biggest change that we see as a result of this Norman Conquest of England, is a transition from an economy that's based on crude slavery. The slave trade was pretty egregious, I think, in the Anglo-Saxon England. It was just crude slavery in the worst form. Buying and selling of individuals from Scandinavia, from Britain. They'd sell people to the Moors of Al-Andalus down in Iberia or Spain, those Berber people down there. There was a pretty complex slave trade. And this crude slavery was a really nasty thing because you were secure in no sense. You had no security that you would stay even with your master and your family and the land, that you're working at any given time. There's no security for anyone, and life is really hard for a slave. William puts his foot down on the slave trade. He does away with it, and he transitions to a system of feudalism. He expands that French feudalism that he found in Normandy to Britain. This is a system based on the land. So really, this is a transition from labor being the most important resource to land being the most important resource. And that is a very significant economic development. And land is going to remain the most important resource in Britain until the Industrial Revolution, when capital resources are going to become the most important. So that is quite how revolutionary this Norman Conquest is. I think it's comparable to the significance of the Industrial Revolution itself, because this was the leap from labor to land, and then the Industrial Revolution is the leap from land to capital. It is the transition from slavery to feudalism, and I hear a lot of people all the time say that feudalism is just glorified slavery, and I find that to be a little naive, because it's not quite as horrible as slavery. In fact, there's a lot of pluses to being a serf opposed to a slave. As a serf, you have the security of being tied down to a plot of land. You're born on the land that your fathers worked before you. You'll be there your entire life. You will live a very simple life. They weren't working 16 hours in sweatshops like the people during the years of the Industrial Revolution. These are people that work seasonally on the land, and life wasn't necessarily always that bad for a serf. You could make a good life for yourself. You could always, you'd always have food, you'd always have shelter, you'd know where you're going to live. Granted, that food and shelter is probably very modest, and you certainly lack lots of civil liberties, but this is the Middle Ages, and this is, I think, a significant jump in the standard of living for your average person from a system with slaves at the base to a system with serfs at the base. So these are the biggest changes that we see in England as a result of the Norman Conquest. William rules England until his death in 1087. When William died, he was buried in Normandy in an abbey, and he had picked out his burial place. And the burial place was basically a niche in the abbey floor, and he was supposed to be lowered into it. And all was good when he picked out this burial place. But like a lot of old conquerors, he got kind of fat as an old man, because he lived a pretty long life. He was always in shape as a young man. He got fat as an old guy. And when it came time to bury him, he was too fat for the grave. So his servants got pieces of wood, basically like 2x4s, and they pried him in to the niche during his funeral service. And supposedly his body burst open, and this really putrid smell just filled the abbey. And it made for a really disgusting funeral. People were supposedly vomiting, which made the stench and everything much worse, and it became a very nasty end to the life of a really remarkable figure in history. So I've been talking for a very long time, if you haven't noticed. Thank you to anyone who is still watching this video. I really appreciate your time, and I would really appreciate a like or a comment or a subscription below. Seriously, give me feedback if you have it. I love to hear what people have to say, and have a good night. Thanks for watching.